Hello, my name is Cindy Knight, and today I'll be speaking about albiism as a social structure oppression in Australia. Albiism refers to prejudiced and systematic disadvantages directed at people with disabilities, rooted in the assumptions that able-bodied lives are more valuable or normal. According to the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, about 1 in 5 Australians live with disability, yet they are consistently facing discrimination, exclusion, and inequality. My presentation will focus on 3 areas: the causes of albiism, the consequences, and why it is so important for criminologists to understand this social problem. Albiism is partly driven by cultural stereotypes. Narrow Redman describes how albiism manifests as both overt prejudice and more subtle forms like pity or inspirational narratives. These cultural assumptions devalue disabled people and sustain inequality. In Australia, Kanachi found in a national study that disability-based discrimination was strongly linked to poor health outcomes, showing that prejudice is not abstract. It creates real harm. Albiism is also embedded in institutions. The Royal Commission documented widespread abuse, neglect, and exploitation of people with disabilities in schools, healthcare, housing, and workplaces. These are not isolated incidences, but evidence of systematic exclusion. As Hutton and Skissy explain, many institutions operate on able-bodied norms, which makes exclusion the default. Finally, albiism is intensified when it intersects with other forms of oppression. The AIHW reports that women with disabilities are more likely to experience violence than men with disabilities, and Indigenous Australians with disabilities face compounded disadvantages due to racism and Australia's structural history of colonisation. One of the most serious consequences of albiism is violence. The Royal Commission found pervasive violence and neglect in institutional and community settings. The AIHW also shows that people with disabilities are at greater risk of domestic, family, and sexual violence. Ringland analysed New South Wales crime data and confirmed that people with disability experience higher rate victimisations across multiple offence categories. Exclusion also damages health. Temple and Kalia found that disability exclusion is strongly associated with psychological distress. Similarly, Kunjaki showed a clear relationship between disability discrimination and poor physical and mental health outcomes. Another consequence of albiism is economic exclusion. It traps people in poverty and unemployment, which in turn has serious impacts on mental and physical health. According to AIHW, only 48% of working age Australians with disabilities are employed compared to 80% of those without disabilities. Finally, albinism results in widespread social exclusion. According to AIHW, 1 in 5 Australians with disability report experience discrimination each year, particularly in education and employment. This reinforces a cycle of disadvantages where exclusion is one area that leads to further marginalizations in others. So why does this matter for criminologists? First, criminologists must understand that people with disabilities are disproportionately victims of crime. Ringland highlights higher rates of victimizations across crime types, while Connor emphasizes that Australia lacks specific disability hate crime legislation. This gap means much disabled violence remains invisible. Second, the Royal Commissioner found that disabled victims often face barriers in reporting crime, inaccessibility process, not being believed, and re-traumatization within the justice system. Criminologists cannot ignore how ableism shapes across the justice system, shapes access to justice. Third, intersectional matters. The AIHW shows that disabled women face greater risk of violence, and Indigenous Australians with disability are overrepresented in both victimisation and justice system involvement. For criminologists, failing to consider these overlapping oppressions risks silencing those most affected. Finally, criminologists play a vital role in policy and reform. The Royal Commission called for systematic change to end violence, abuse, and neglect. Criminologists must engage with this evidence to build inclusive policies and practices. In summary, albinism in Australia is caused by cultural prejudice, institutionalised neglect, economic exclusion, and intersectional disadvantages. Its consequences are profound: violence, poor mental health, systematic poverty, and social exclusion. For criminologists, understanding albinism is essential to analysing victimisation, access to justice, and systematic inequality. As the Royal Commission concluded, addressing violence and discrimination against people with disabilities must be a national priority. Criminologists can play and should play a central role in dismantling albinism and building a justice system that is inclusive, equal, and fair.